We're looking at the Bible passages this week that remind us of God's miraculous rescue of his people when we are in distress or when he shows up to make all the difference that we needed. Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Wednesday. The Apostle Paul was the first missionary to actually leave his comfort zone to carry the gospel. Well, of course, there was Jesus Christ who left heaven to bring the good news to this world. But leaving his comfort zone for Paul didn't just mean that he was going to a new geographic location. It didn't just mean they were going to speak a different language or dialect. He also worked in areas that were very hostile to him and the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. There were those who had lost their income because they formerly sold these small idol statues that new Christians were not buying. Or those who were using a demon-possessed girl until Paul drove that demon from her and made them angry. He writes some about the distress that he had to face in hostile parts of the country in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 5. When we came to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. It seems like the grueling travel and maybe the not so great accommodations was just a part of the difficulties for a missionary in those days. There was not always an abundance of provisions for buying food or daily needs. And here he speaks of more than just a lack of rest for their bodies, but the opposition that they faced. When he says they were troubled on every side, we cannot imagine the kind of enemies that he faced. Sometimes we think that we're persecuted because someone refuses to accept our invitation to church, or maybe someone doesn't listen to our presentation of the gospel. But for Paul, he says outside there were conflicts. We know Paul's own testimony says that 5 times he was beaten with whips. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned and left for dead. Suffered shipwreck in his travels. And that's just on the outside. He says inside there were fears. You know, even for the seasoned missionary, there had to be some anxiety about facing a new city or stirring up more religious people. So he says in 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 6, but God, who comforts us, the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was comforted in you. At perhaps his lowest times, God stepped in to save the day. This time it was by sending young Titus to encourage him through this distress. I'm sure these young men like Timothy and Titus were a great encouragement and help to Paul, who may have been getting on in years and continuing in this work. Don't miss this caveat, by the way, where Paul is writing to the church in Corinth and saying, the greatest reason that Titus was such an encouragement to me was because you had encouraged him in the first place. It may have been that they had sent along some help for his journey. Maybe they had even sent some provisions for Paul when he was completely out of supplies and maybe no food left in his knapsack. He describes how God here is the one who comforts the downcast. He shows us when we feel like everyone else has abandoned us, God shows up. Like Elijah in the Old Testament, who once said, I am the only one left to worship you, God. Of course, that wasn't true, but that's how he felt. And perhaps one of the lowest times in his ministry and travels, Paul says, but God sent a comforter. Seemingly out of nowhere, God showed up to rescue his disciple here who was deep in distress. I think that we need to be looking more for those instances in our own life every day. Instead of focusing on our troubles or the conflicts and the fears, let's look for ways that God shows up. He can provide our greatest need. He can lift up our fallen spirits. He can provide for every need that we need when we're distressed. We need to look around because we know there is a but God that will show up in our story.